there's a particular moment that happens in a man's life, and if you've lived long enough, you've either witnessed it or you've been inside it. It doesn't announce itself. There's no dramatic event, no single catastrophe. It's quieter than that. You can see it in the way he checks his phone, the speed at which he responds to her messages versus the hours it takes him to return a text from his closest friend. You can see it in the way his calendar has slowly reorganized itself around her availability. The way his gym routine now has gaps. The way conversations with him feel lighter, less substantial, as though some essential weight has been removed from his presence. He'll tell you he's happy. He'll say he's finally found something real. But if you know what to look for, you can see the transaction happening beneath the surface. He is trading pieces of himself for the possibility of her continued affection. He doesn't realize this is what he's doing. In his mind, this is what love requires. This is what devotion looks like. But something older than his conscious understanding is watching this exchange, and it's taking notes. She is taking notes, even if she doesn't realize it, because a woman's attraction isn't static. It doesn't freeze in place the moment she decides she likes you. It responds continuously to what you are becoming in real time. And when a man begins to orient his entire existence around her, when his mission becomes her comfort, when his boundaries dissolve in service of her approval, he doesn't realize he's dismantling the very structure that made him attractive in the first place. I've worked with men who described this process years after it happened, and they all use similar language. They talk about feeling like they were living someone else's life. They represent a slow suffocation they couldn't name while it was happening. One man told me he looked at photos of himself from 2 years prior and didn't recognize the person staring back, not because his appearance had changed dramatically, but because something in his eyes was different. There was a clarity in the older photos that a kind of anxious accommodation had replaced. He had become a man whose primary orientation was to avoid disappointing her, and in doing so, he had become disappointing. This isn't a video about avoiding relationships or withdrawing from women. This is about understanding a mechanism that Machiavelli identified 500 years ago, one that applies just as precisely to romantic dynamics as it does to political power. It's about recognizing that respect and affection operate on different economies, and that when you pursue one at the expense of the other, you end up with neither. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why the man who chases love finds it slipping away, and what fundamental law of human nature he's violating without realizing it. Niccolo Machiavelli wrote in a world where survival depended on correctly reading power. 16th century Italy was a theater of constant betrayal, shifting alliances, and brutal consequences for miscalculation. City-states rose and fell based on whether their leaders understood a straightforward principle. People respect what they cannot fully control, and they lose respect for what becomes entirely predictable and available. Machiavelli wasn't writing philosophy for the sake of ideas. He was writing survival manuals for men who couldn't afford to misread human nature. And what he understood about power translates directly into what modern men fail to realize about attraction and relationship dynamics. Here is the thesis that runs beneath everything Machiavelli observed, translated into the language of modern masculine experience. A man who reorganizes his life around the pursuit and retention of a woman's affection gradually destroys the qualities that generated her attraction in the first place. He becomes, through his own devotion, the kind of man she can no longer respect. This isn't a moral judgment, it's a mechanical observation about how desire and respect function in the human psyche. Machiavelli would say this man has entirely misunderstood the nature of the game. He thinks the goal is to win her over and then relax into comfort. But in reality, the moment he signals that he is completely won over, that his commitment is total and unconditional, he has surrendered the leverage that kept the dynamic alive. In The Prince, Machiavelli writes that it is better to be feared than loved if one cannot be both, because love is sustained by a bond of obligation which, being selfish, is broken when advantage is no longer seen. Fear, on the other hand, is maintained by a dread of consequences which never fails. Translate this into romantic dynamics, and you arrive at an uncomfortable truth. A woman's sustained attraction requires a degree of uncertainty, a perception that the man has options, purpose, and boundaries that exist independent of her. The moment she perceives that he has collapsed his life into her orbit, that he needs her more than she needs him, the attraction begins to erode. Not because she's cruel or calculating in some conscious way, but because human desire is governed by perceived value, and perceived value is always relational. When you make yourself entirely available, entirely predictable, entirely without mystery or autonomous direction, you have signaled how little value the oldest language biology understands. Look at how this plays out in the modern dating environment. A man meets a woman who genuinely interests him. Early interactions are electric because both parties are still unknown quantities to each other. He has his routines, his friendships, his sense of direction. She sees a man with momentum, but then something shifts. He starts to believe that securing her requires maximum investment, maximum availability, maximum accommodation. He cancels plans with friends when she's free. He texts back immediately, every time, afraid that delayed responses signal disinterest. He begins to modify his opinions in conversations, sanding down the edges that might create friction. He stops mentioning his own goals and plans because he's afraid they might conflict with the time spent together. He interprets her occasional distance or mood shifts as problems he must immediately solve. So he pursues, he asks what's wrong, and he tries harder. And here's what Machiavelli would recognize instantly. This man has misread the currency of the interaction. He thinks he's building trust and intimacy. What he's actually doing is demonstrating that he has no competing priorities, no internal compass that operates independently of her emotional weather. He has made himself a satellite, and satellites don't inspire passion. They inspire comfort and eventually indifference. The woman on the receiving end of this behavior rarely articulates what's happening. She'll say she's not sure why things feel different. She'll say maybe they moved too fast, or perhaps the chemistry has faded. But what's actually happened is that his perceived value has collapsed because he revealed himself to be a man without leverage, without mystery, without anything in his life that competes for his attention. Machiavelli understood that the prince who appears weak invites rebellion rather than loyalty. The man who seems desperate invites testing, not devotion. A woman's attraction is not a reward for good behavior. It's a response to the perception of strength, autonomy, and options. When you behave as though you have no options, as though she is the only source of meaning in your life, you have communicated weakness at a level more fundamental than words. And unlike negotiated attraction or logical affection, this kind of response happens beneath conscious control. She can't simply decide to remain attracted to a man who has made himself harmless, pliable, and entirely predictable. Biology doesn't work that way. I once spoke to a man who described the exact moment he felt the shift. He had been dating a woman for 4 months. Things were good, but one weekend he had an opportunity to attend a professional event in another city, something that could have advanced his career. She mentioned offhandedly that she'd been hoping they could spend that weekend together. He cancelled the trip. He told himself it was a gesture of commitment, but he noticed that after that weekend, something in her tone changed. The texts became less frequent. The warmth became more effortful. He couldn't understand it. He had sacrificed for her, proving his commitment. But what he'd actually proven was that he would abandon his own path the moment she expressed a preference. He had shown her that his mission was negotiable, and in doing so, he became less interesting, less attractive, less necessary. 6 weeks later, she ended it. She said she needed space to figure out what she wanted. But what she'd really figured out was that he wasn't the man she thought he was. So how does this collapse actually happen, step by step, inside a man's psyche? Because the destruction isn't instant, it's incremental. It occurs through 1,000 small choices that feel reasonable in isolation, but compound into a structural failure of self-respect. It begins with what feels like generosity. The man decides that because he cares about this woman, he should prioritize her happiness. This sounds noble. It sounds like maturity. And in measured doses, attentiveness is part of any healthy relationship. But in most cases, the man sees her satisfaction as the primary measure of his own success. If she's happy, he's doing it right. If she's distant or upset, he's failing. This is the first cognitive error, the one that sets everything else in motion. He has outsourced his sense of adequacy to her emotional state, meaning he is no longer operating from a centered, autonomous position. He is reactive. He is trying to manage her feelings, which is another way of saying he's trying to control something outside his control. At first, this shows up in small accommodations. He agrees to plans he doesn't actually prefer. He watches shows he's not interested in. He modifies his schedule. None of these things is catastrophic on its own, but they establish a pattern. They communicate to her, and more importantly to himself, that his preferences are secondary. And here's what most men don't realize. Every time you override your own preference to accommodate hers without her even asking, you are training her to perceive you as a man without strong desires of your own. You are teaching her that your boundaries are soft, negotiable, and ultimately irrelevant. The second phase is justification, when he starts to feel the weight of this new arrangement, when he notices that he stopped going to the gym as often, or that he hasn't seen his friends in weeks, or that his work has started to slip. He tells himself a story. He describes himself as saying, "This is temporary. Once the relationship stabilizes, he'll get back to his routines." He describes himself as saying that relationships require sacrifice, and this is just what mature men do. He compares himself to other men who seem even more absorbed in their relationships, and tells himself he's not that bad. But what he's really doing is negotiating away his sovereignty piece by piece and using the language of commitment to justify it. The woman, during this time, is not consciously orchestrating any of this. She's simply responding to what she sees. And what she sees is a man whose life has become smaller and more predictable. Where there was once mystery and autonomy, there is now availability and accommodation. Where there was once a sense that he had a mission she was lucky to be included in, there is now a sense that she is the mission. And this changes everything, because attraction requires tension, and tension requires two separate poles. When a man collapses into a woman's frame, when his identity begins to merge with hers, the polarity disappears. What remains is comfort, familiarity, and eventually, a quiet loss of desire. The third phase is self-abandonment, where the real damage occurs. By this point, the man has rewired his entire decision-making process around one question: what will make her happy? What will avoid conflict? What will keep her from pulling away? He stops voicing disagreements because he's afraid they'll create distance. He apologizes for things he doesn't believe he did wrong because smoothing things over feels safer than standing his ground. He begins to monitor his own thoughts and impulses, filtering them through the question of how she'll react. He has become a man who constantly performs a version of himself that he believes she wants, and he's lost touch with the version that existed before this relationship began. Here's what this looks like in granular detail. He wakes up, and the first thing he does is check his phone to see if she's texted. I suppose if she has, his mood lifts. If she hasn't, a low-level anxiety settles in. He spends the first 20 minutes of his day crafting the perfect response, trying to strike the right tone, interested but not desperate, engaged but not needy. He goes to work, but part of his attention is always on his phone, waiting for her reply. When she takes hours to respond, he spirals. He wonders if he said something wrong. He replays the last conversation. He drafts new messages and deletes them. Meanwhile, his actual work suffers. His presence in meetings is diminished because he's not fully there. His friends notice he's distant, distracted. They stop inviting him to things because he keeps cancelling so many times, always with the same excuse: she needed him, they had plans, or the timing wasn't right. His gym routine disappears, not all at once, but gradually. He misses a session because they stayed up late talking, then another because she wanted to spend the morning together. Soon, weeks have passed, and he looks in the mirror and sees the slow erosion of the discipline that once defined him. His sleep deteriorates because the text conversations stretch into the early hours, and he can't bring himself to end them, afraid that setting a boundary will be interpreted as disinterest. He starts drinking more, eating worse, because the structures that once held his life together have been dismantled in service of maximum availability. And here's the cruelest part: the more he sacrifices, the less she respects him. Not because she's a bad person, but because she's a bad person, but because respect is not generated by sacrifice. Respect is generated by strength, by boundaries, by the perception that a man knows his own value and won't betray himself to secure someone else's approval. Every time he abandons his plans for her, every time he apologizes for something he doesn't believe warrants an apology, every time he texts immediately, at the same time, she takes hours, and he is communicating that his time and attention are less valuable than hers. And she absorbs this information, not intellectually, but instinctively. I worked with a man in his early 30s who described this process with brutal clarity. He said that 6 months into the relationship, he realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd done something purely because he wanted to, independent of her schedule or preferences. He had become a supporting character in his own life. The woman he was dating started to become irritable around him, picking fights over small things. He interpreted this as a sign that he needed to try harder. to be more attentive. So he doubled down. He planned elaborate dates, sent longer texts, and offered more reassurance. And the more he did this, the more she pulled away. Eventually, she ended the relationship. She told him she needed to be with someone who had a stronger sense of direction. He was devastated. He thought he'd given her everything. But that was precisely the problem. He'd given her everything, which meant he'd kept nothing for himself. And a man with nothing left for himself is not a man or a woman can follow. The contrast is striking when you observe a man who understands this dynamic. He likes the woman, he enjoys her company, but his life doesn't reorganize itself around her. When she texts, he responds when it's natural for him to respond, not out of anxiety. When she's upset, he offers presence, but he doesn't grovel or frantically try to fix her emotions. When plans conflict, he's comfortable choosing his prior commitment without guilt or over-explanation. And the result? She respects him more. She pursues him more, not because he's playing games, but because he's operating from a centered place where her approval is not the axis around which his entire existence rotates. She can feel the difference between a man who is with her because she enriches his life and one who is with her for other reasons. After all, he has no life without her. Now, zoom out from the individual man and look at the system he's navigating, because his confusion isn't personal failure, it's the predictable result of living in a culture that has completely obscured the rules of this game, while simultaneously raising the stakes to catastrophic levels. Modern men are told, from every direction, that the path to a woman's heart is maximum emotional availability, maximum vulnerability, maximum deference to her feelings. They're told that masculinity itself is suspect, that strength is toxicity, that boundaries are selfishness. The culture insists that a good man centers women's needs, listens without judgment, and never makes a woman uncomfortable. And then these same men are bewildered when the women they've bent themselves into pretzels for lose attraction and leave. They followed the script. They did everything right. So why did it fail? Machiavelli would see this immediately as a catastrophic misunderstanding of human nature. Public morality, the acceptable narrative, is almost always at odds with the underlying mechanics of power and desire. In The Prince, he writes that a man who wishes to act entirely virtuously in every way necessarily comes to grief among so many who are not virtuous. In other words, operating according to the idealized rulebook while everyone else is responding to older, deeper instincts puts you at a severe disadvantage. The modern man who takes cultural messaging seriously, who genuinely tries to be the perfectly accommodating, endlessly available, emotionally transparent partner, discovers too late that he's been playing a game with false rules. The woman isn't operating according to those rules, she can't. Her attraction mechanisms were formed over millennia, and they respond to demonstrations of strength, autonomy, and outcome independence, not to well-meaning compliance. Add to this the structural realities of the modern dating market. Apps have created an attention economy, where the average woman has vastly more options than the average man. This isn't a moral statement, it's a statistical one. The result is that a man's perceived replaceability has increased dramatically, while his sense of leverage has decreased. When a woman can open an app and have 50 men expressing interest within an hour, the man who makes himself entirely available, entirely predictable, is indistinguishable from the crowd of other men doing the same thing. He has nothing that distinguishes him except the intensity of his pursuit, and intensity without underlying value is just neediness. Then layer on the legal and social risks. A man who enters a relationship today does so in an environment where the consequences of failure are asymmetrically distributed. Divorce courts, custody arrangements, and the court of public opinion all tilt heavily against men. A woman can leave at any time, take the children, take half the assets, and face no social penalty. In fact, she'll often be celebrated for her courage in leaving. A man who leaves is abandoning his family. A man who stays in a failing relationship is usually doing so not out of love, but out of fear of what he'll lose if he doesn't. Machiavelli would recognize this as a system where the prince has no absolute authority, only obligations, and a prince without authority cannot govern effectively. He becomes a figurehead, going through the motions, while real power resides elsewhere. The cost of living blind to these realities accumulates silently. A man loses his mission because he no longer has time or energy for it. His work suffers, his friendships atrophy, his health declines, his self-respect erodes because he's violated his own boundaries so many times that he's no longer sure he has any. He becomes a stranger to himself. The man he sees in the mirror is someone he doesn't particularly like, anxious, reactive, smaller than he used to be, and because he's outsourced his sense of worth to her perception of him, he can't even trust his own assessment of reality. If she says he's being too sensitive, he doubts his own feelings. If she says he's not doing enough, he believes her, even when he's already given everything. This is what Machiavelli meant when he warned that a prince who relies entirely on the goodwill of others will find himself without support the moment fortune turns. A man who has made a woman's approval the foundation of his identity will find himself without identity the moment she withdraws that approval. And she will withdraw it, not out of malice, but because a man who has no center, no autonomous source of value, becomes unbearable to be around. He's too much work. He requires constant reassurance, constant management, and constant emotional labor. She becomes exhausted by the weight of his dependence. And so she leaves, not to be cruel, but to survive. If you're a man and you ignore this, you will find yourself 5 years from now in a relationship that feels like a cage, or alone and confused, running the same loops, wondering why nothing ever works. You will have collected more experiences that confirm the story you're already telling yourself, that you're not enough, that love requires self-erasure, that the problem is you're not trying hard enough. And you will wake up one day and realize you spent years building a life you don't recognize for a woman who isn't even there anymore, in service of a version of love that never existed outside the cultural script you were handed. If a system demands your vulnerability but offers no protection, walking away isn't cowardice, it's wisdom. If the price of admission is the slow dismantling of your self-respect, the ticket isn't worth buying. She doesn't kill your purpose, she reflects its absence. And if you allow your life to become a reaction to her moods, her needs, her approval, you haven't found love. You found another form of slavery. So what does sovereignty look like in practice? Not as a list of tactics, but as a fundamental reorientation of how a man moves through relationships. First, notice when your calendar stops reflecting your priorities and starts reflecting hers. Most men don't even realize this has happened until months in. Your gym sessions have become optional. Your friendships have migrated to the margins. The project you are excited about sits untouched because there's always something else he wants to do. Sovereignty begins with the refusal to let this continue. It doesn't mean you ignore her. It means you stop abandoning yourself. When she asks if you're free Friday night and you have plans with a friend, you say you're not available. You don't apologize. You don't over-explain. You hold your boundary. And you observe what happens. If she respects it, the relationship strengthens. If she resents it, you've learned something crucial about whether this dynamic is worth your continued investment. Second, recognize emotional kneeling when you're doing it, and stop. Emotional kneeling is when you sense her pulling away, and your immediate response is to pursue harder, to offer more reassurance, to ask what's wrong, to try to fix her mood. This feels like care. It feels like attentiveness. But what it actually communicates is that you can't tolerate her distance, which means you're dependent on her proximity for your emotional stability. Machiavelli would say, this is the moment you've revealed your weakness. A sovereign man allows her to have her distance without panicking. He continues to operate from his own center. He doesn't withdraw love or affection, but he also doesn't chase. He lets there be space, because he trusts that if the relationship has genuine value, she'll return to it. And if she doesn't, he's learned that it wasn't built on solid ground to begin with. Third, stop outsourcing your sense of adequacy to her emotional state. This is the deepest trap. When her mood determines your mood, when her happiness is the primary metric of whether you're doing life correctly, you've handed her a level of power that no person should have over another. Your adequacy as a man is not measured by whether she's satisfied in every moment. It's measured by whether you're living according to your own standards, pursuing your own mission, and maintaining your own integrity. Begin to move as if your worth is not up for debate, not arrogantly, but quietly, with the kind of self-possession that doesn't need constant external validation. You'll notice that the less you need her approval, the more freely she offers it. Fourth, refuse to negotiate your mission. If you're building something, a business, a body of work, a skill set, a physical transformation, that trajectory doesn't pause because a woman enters your life. She either fits into the life you're building or she doesn't. And if she doesn't, the relationship isn't sustainable. This sounds harsh until you realize that women don't actually want men who abandon their purpose for them. That's not a fantasy. The fantasy is to be with a man whose purpose is so compelling that she feels fortunate to be included in it. When you negotiate your mission away to make room for her, you're not winning her loyalty. You're confirming that you didn't have a real mission in the first place. Fifth, allow her to experience the consequences of her own behavior without rushing to shield her from discomfort. If she's rude to you, don't immediately smooth it over with a joke or a subject change. Let there be silence. Let her feel the weight of what she just did. If she cancels plans at the last minute, don't immediately reassure her that it's fine. Instead, suggest 3 alternative times. Pull back. Let her wonder if there's a cost to treating your time as negotiable. This isn't punishment, it's simply refusing to train her to believe that your boundaries don't exist. Machiavelli wrote that cruelty well used is that which is done once, for self-preservation and not persisted in. Apply this. A single calm boundary enforced early is more effective than months of resentment and eventual explosion. These aren't tactics. They're expressions of a man who knows his value and refuses to betray it. The woman in your life will test this, consciously or unconsciously. She will create situations where the easy path is to fold, to accommodate, to prioritize her comfort over your integrity. And every time you hold your ground without cruelty, without defensiveness, simply with calm certainty, you are building the kind of respect that sustained attraction requires. She may not thank you for it in words, but her behavior will change. She'll invest more, she'll respect you more, she'll feel safer, paradoxically, because she's with a man who can't be easily moved. There are 2 versions of your life waiting for you, and the choice you make in the next 6 months will determine which one becomes real. In the first version, you ignore what you've heard here. You tell yourself it doesn't apply to you, or that your situation is different, or that the woman you're with is the exception. You continue to organize your life around her emotional weather. You keep canceling your plans when she's available. You continue to apologize for things you don't believe warrant apologies. You continue to check your phone every 5 minutes, continue to feel that low-level anxiety whenever she's distant, and continue to modify your opinions and preferences to avoid conflict. And 5 years from now, you wake up next to someone who doesn't respect you, or you wake up alone, scrolling through dating apps at 2 a.m., wondering why every relationship follows the same pattern. You'll have less energy, less confidence, and less clarity about who you even are. The edges that once defined you will have been sanded down into something smooth and forgettable. You'll be a man who is pleasant, accommodating, and utterly uninteresting. And the women you attract will reflect that. They'll be women looking for someone to manage, someone safe, someone who won't challenge them or require anything from them except validation. And you'll accept it because by that point, you won't believe you deserve anything else. In the second version, you treat this moment as an initiation. You recognize that the discomfort you're feeling right now, the resistance to these ideas, is because they're asking you to reclaim parts of yourself you've abandoned. You begin, slowly, to rebuild your life around your own mission instead of around the management of someone else's emotions. You go back to the gym, even when it's inconvenient. You reinvest in friendships that have atrophied. You say no without guilt when your boundaries are tested. You stop checking your phone every 30 seconds. You stop apologizing for having preferences. You allow for distance, conflict, and discomfort without immediately rushing to resolve them. And it's harder at first. It's lonelier. Some women will leave because they were only interested in the man they could control, and you let them go. But over time, something shifts. You become quieter, but heavier. Your presence changes. People notice. Women notice, not because you're performing some strategy, but because you're no longer performing at all. You're simply a man who knows what he's building and isn't willing to negotiate it away. 5 years from that decision, you're in a relationship that doesn't feel like a cage, where you're alone, but not lonely, because your life has substance independent of anyone else's validation. The woman you're with, if there is one, respects you because she's seen you hold boundaries, pursue goals, and weather discomfort without collapsing. She trusts you because you're not malleable, and respect creates safety, and safety creates genuine intimacy, the kind that doesn't require constant reassurance because it's built on something real. You're not rich, necessarily, you're not famous, but you're not a stranger to yourself anymore, and that's worth more than anything else. Here's the thesis one more time, stripped to its core. The moment you make a woman the center of your life, you begin to destroy her ability to respect you. not because she's shallow, but because respect requires the perception of strength, autonomy, and purpose that exists independent of her. You cannot negotiate desire. You cannot earn attraction through sacrifice. The more you abandon yourself to secure her approval, the less approval you will receive. She does not kill your purpose. She reflects its absence. The collapse you feel isn't her doing. It's the structural failure that happens when a man tries to build a life on the foundation of someone else's approval. And if you refuse to see this, you will spend years wondering why love keeps slipping through your fingers, never realizing that you're the one letting it go by refusing to hold on to yourself. If something in this landed, if you felt the weight of recognition, then share this with another man who needs to hear it. Subscribe to keep this work alive, because most men are walking through this blind, and the cost is their dignity, their mission, and their self-respect. Machiavelli understood that the prince who tries to be loved by everyone ends up respected by no one. The man who tries to secure a woman's love by becoming whatever she needs him to be ends up being nothing to anyone, least of all himself. Hold your ground. Protect your mission. Let her orbit enter your life, not the other way around. And if she can't respect a man with boundaries, let her find someone without them. And watch how quickly she loses respect for him too.